Hi, welcome everyone. Please sign into the chat when you get here, or you can sign into the Q&A if you have a question. And then Maya's going to actually have a little activity for you to do that is going to ask you to also interact and sign in. So welcome. I'm pleased to introduce Maya Mackrandilal today. Maya is a multidisciplinary artist and writer based in Los Angeles. She's a mixed race woman of color with global roots. She received her BA in studio art with high distinction from the University of Virginia and her MFA in studio art from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, where she was a Jacob J. Javits Fellow. She has shown her artwork nationally and has published essays in art criticism, creative nonfiction, and poetry. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here, Maya. Maya is one of the members of the Association of Hysteric Curators who's come to speak to us, and I just want to give a special shout out and thank you to the organization, as well as to Grand Central Art Center, and John Spiek specifically, who helped fund this program, and the College of the Arts at Cal State Fullerton. Thank you, Maya, for being here today.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you to all the sponsors for this. And hello and hi to the students. I'm sad that I can't see you all, but I'm happy that you're here. It would be great if in the chat you could give me, do a 2-word check-in. So how are you feeling using 2 words? So I'll go first. I'm feeling like a little anxious, but also just very excited to share my work with you. So yeah, in the chat, if you want to put in 2 words, how you're feeling. I'll kind of hang out here for a second. Actually, I'll start. See, anxious and curious, cool. Anxious and motivated, sleepy and excited. I like that dichotomy of sleepy and excited. Happy and calm. Happy and curious, cool. Exhausted and hopeful, tired and excited. Again, that interesting, like we think of excited as like so intense, but then tired is like so draining. So like that you sort of have these two, anxious and exhausted, happy and grateful. That's cool. Thanks so much, everybody. You can keep sharing in the chat. But I just wanted to do, maybe before I started talking about my work, just a really quick sort of breathing exercise to get us all grounded. Because I know we got a couple anxious in there. And if you're tired, maybe this will kind of help wake your body up a little bit. So if we could do some breathing, we're going to breathe in for a count of 5 and hold for 2 and then breathe out for 7. And as we breathe in, we'll lift our shoulders up. And then as we breathe out, we'll let them down. So breathe in through your nose, hold for 2, and then breathe out. And let your whole body kind of relax. Then you breathe in and breathe out. You can wiggle around a little bit, get your body relaxed. Okay, well, breathe in. One last time, as deep as you can go, shoulders up to your ears, and breathe out. Let it all go. Okay, so hopefully we're a little more grounded now. I'm going to share my screen and then play from start. Okay, great. So I actually wanted to start out with a piece that is not my work. It is the work of a Cuban American artist named Ana Mendieta. And actually, before I get into my talk, I do want to just very briefly just sort of have like a little bit of a just like a little caveat as we begin. Some of the issues that I'm kind of touching on in my work, it has to do with generational trauma, with colonialism. There is some discussion of sexual violence, racism. So, like not always like the most comfortable subjects. So I just encourage you to take care of yourself. If you need to, take a deep breath, ground yourself, like step away for a moment, because there's something that's just difficult for you right now, that's totally understandable. But I hope you'll come along with me because even though I'm dealing with these really heavy issues, I hopefully it's not heavy work. So anyways, that's sort of like my little statement before I begin. And then I wanted to start with this um, this book cover actually. So I had this experience when I was in undergraduate where I was in our fine arts library at school, and I was walking down the stacks, and the way the books happened to be arranged that day, this book cover was facing out. So I saw this image as I was walking down. And I had this experience, I was sort of like arrested by this image and drawn to it. And I just felt this like opening up inside of me. And then I remember the experience of like flipping through this book and like seeing her work, and it was this embodied experience. I have there's an artist I know, Edgar Fabian Frias, and they call this a portal. And so they have a story of being in LACMA and seeing the specific sculpture and having this experience of being transported by an art object. And I think most artists probably have these sort of formative experiences with artwork. But I don't think we really talk about like what is that experience? Like what is happening like when you have this sort of like full-bodied emotional spiritual reaction to a work of art, and really how significant that experience is. Um, so I feel like that's sort of a thread that is in a lot of my work, is thinking about that experience and wanting to create more opportunities for that experience for myself and for others. Um, so so yeah, and I think another thread that I'm kind of trying to pull through is that opening up is a space of possibility and a space where healing can happen as we sort of explore these more traumatic ideas and histories and even present and future positions. So my next slide that I wanted to share. So this is a diagram that I created. It's based on a conversation I had with my grandmother, and essentially she was sort of telling me our family history, but she was kind of jumping around and like telling it to me out of order. And so after we had this conversation, or to sort of organize it in my mind, I drew this diagram of where we're like quote unquote from and like what our roots are. And so there's some trauma in these stories, in this history. I have ancestors who were indentured laborers from India. I have an ancestor who was an enslaved West African woman, and then I have ancestors from who were Chinese indentured laborers. But primarily on my mother's side, it's it's sort of South Asian, um, and so that's kind of like the main influence in my work is sort of South Asian art and culture. But then I was born in the U.S. and grew up here, and I'm mixed race, so there are lots of influences sort of weaving in together with that. Um, so I kind of wanted to share this because these stories often are kind of exist at the root of a lot of my work. And I see that like the telling of these stories, because these are really stories that were not meant to be preserved, like my ancestors were people that were seen as, like basically like objects of labor. They weren't seen as people with full lives and potentials for creativity. So I really see myself as sort of like the continuation of their survival, and that it's important that um, I create ways to sort of continue to retell their histories. Um, And so one of the stories I want to share with you, because she kind of comes up in a couple of different ways in my work over the years, is my grandmother's grandmother. So my grandmother's Aji. Aji is a term for grandmother. Her name was Ramsuki. And the story that I received from my grandmother was that Ramsuki was maybe like between 10 and 12 years old, went to get some water from a well in her home in rural India, and was kidnapped by a group of marauders. And those marauders eventually sold her to the British as an indentured laborer. And so then she was sent to Guyana, which is the country in South America where my mother is from. And while she was in the boat, she was married to like a much older man. So she's 10 to 12 years old, being married to like a very grown man, like maybe middle age. I don't know exactly how old he was. And so she eventually has 2 children with him, and then he abandons her. And so she raises her 2 sons on her own. So this is like a pretty traumatic situation. My grandmother in our modern, or my grandmother's grandmother in our modern way of looking at things was kind of like human trafficked and sex trafficked, and never got to see her family ever again. And those are not things that just go away on their own. They require healing practices. And in a lot of ways, the communities that my ancestors came from didn't have, like, they had lost the healing practices that would have been in the community to deal with some of these things. So my work kind of deals with these stories as ways to try to find or create these sort of new healing practices that are sort of based in our history, since our history is so distinct from where we come from. So that's a little backstory. And then one more image that I wanted to share with you is this image. So typically artists don't share work from when they were in undergrad. I feel like, maybe if we're being honest, I think we're sort of taught to maybe be a little embarrassed by this work, to see it as like not 100% realized or, fully matured. But I wanted to share this piece that I made with my mother when I was probably, as an undergrad, so I was around your age. And it kind of like is a great illustration of a lot of these themes that have sort of continued in my practice. So this took place in a library. It's called Alderman Library at the University of Virginia, where I went to undergrad. And this was in the basement, so like the very, very bottom of the library, very deep underground, because it was built on a hill. And this is the location. So along the left side of the image, you can see there's like a sort of like a cage. And in this cage are a collection of Tibetan scrolls. And so the University of Virginia has one of the most, quote unquote, complete collections of Tibetan, like ancient Tibetan texts. So literally I have seen, like I observed monks who had traveled, to the University of Virginia specifically to access these texts. And this was also where a lot of the South Asian language books were stored in the stacks. So you can see on the right. And I was kind of thinking of this space as, this institutional space that had collected these objects that were from colonized people. And in a way, the books and the texts had traveled along similar I guess, power dynamics as my family had traveled. And I didn't encounter this idea until later, but there's an artist, Badly Licked Bear, and I was watching a workshop with them, and they talked about how a lot of indigenous cultures treat objects as subjects. And I'd never heard it articulated that way, but I feel like that makes a lot of sense for how I tend to think about objects. Not as just, you know, just a thing, like an inanimate thing, but something that has a history, and you could even say like maybe has like some kind of spirit in it. So thinking of these objects, these books and these scrolls as fellow subjects that had been displaced by colonialism. I created a ritual. So I turned off some of the lights. So, this normally the space wouldn't be this dark. It was midnight, and my mother and I circumambulated the space, which is a ritual practice where you symbolically take the architecture into your body. So we circumambulated the space at midnight, and we laid out this cloth scroll that had words that had been originally in Hindi that had been adopted by the English language. And so I felt like those words were really, immigrants as well. And sort of the reasons for their presence were the direct result of British colonialism. Like that's the reason that they're in the English language. So one of these words I'm just going to mention is the word thug. It actually comes from thuggy, which is the word for a bandit or a marauder. And you can remember I have history with marauders in India. So that will come up later. I will mention that again. But I just wanted to mention it now because it was present in this ritual. And I think another thing I want to mention before I move on is this idea of decolonization. At the time, I wasn't familiar with the term when I created this, but I think that in a lot of ways, this was sort of gesturing towards this idea of decolonizing a space, which means acknowledging kind of the trauma of the past and maybe trying to transform the space. And that through ritual, I was making intervention into this space. I was changing its use from this use of collecting to a more spiritual use that was really more in line with some of the texts that were housed there. So maybe kind of inhabiting the space, maybe taking it over a little bit, but maybe a less sort of invested in power word would be decolonization. Okay, so sort of building on that, I definitely had this interest in institutions, especially collecting institutions. So this is at the Fralin Museum of Art, University of Virginia. So we're jumping ahead. That previous work I showed was from 2007. This is from 2013. So shortly after I graduated grad school, I went back to the University of Virginia to teach for a semester. And while I was there, I created this work in discussion with the museum. So before, in the background, you can kind of see there's this new sculpture there, but before that sculpture was installed, there was this empty space because they had removed a Henry Moore sculpture called Seated Woman. And I had been thinking, I'd really like to inhabit the space of this sculpture. Again, playing with this idea of like object as subject, subject as object. And what if we sort of played with our perceptions of that? So, so unfortunately, they installed the sculpture before it got warm enough for me to perform, but I ended up performing a 7.5-hour durational performance. So basically coinciding with the hours the museum was open, I sat as this sculptural object, the seated woman. I named this figure Aji. So I named it after this ancestor. So it means grandmother, but really I was thinking about this particular grandmother, but in many ways, a lot of my foremothers who were, human trafficked, basically, and the ways in which that mirrored the objects, and like because this museum, it's meant to be an encyclopedic museum, and so they have objects from all over, and so they also have objects from South Asia in the museum. So I inhabited this plinth for 7.5 hours, kind of returning the gaze of the viewer, but it was silent. So people did come up to me, ask me if I was real. but I did not answer them. But I would look at them, and it was interesting. It had some really profound, like people were quite struck by this sort of incongruous experience of this object that could look back at you. Um, so so in a way, I did see this as kind of another sort of decolonization ritual. Um, Maybe not like complete decolonization, because I wasn't even really in the space or disrupting the views that were happening in the space, but maybe inserting another way of thinking about objects and the history of these objects, and their relationship to displaced peoples and to the dominant culture, and what does it mean to kind of just sort of gaze upon these objects uncritically. Um, let's see, is there anything else I want to say about this? No, okay. So the next artwork I wanted to talk about is a video installation called Kalpani. So Kalpani is what South Asians call the ocean. It means black water, and essentially what it was considered, like if you were a Hindu and you had a particular caste, if you crossed the black water, you lost that caste. So basically you were sort of expelled from the community, and people who didn't have caste, previously they were referred to as untouchable. Now there are different words that sort of talk about their community in different ways. Um, so this is sort of like a callback to, not only were my ancestors being transported to the other side of the planet, and many of them could not afford to get back once their indenture was over, but there was this larger sort of societal break that happened, and there was never any kind of practice to repair that trauma, and so it kind of just sort of lives in the culture continually. Um, so I shot this footage in 2011. It was right after I had graduated grad school. I got a grant to go to Guyana. And while I was there, my grandmother passed away. And so I was kind of had been collecting footage and images, and I was making objects, and then my grandmother passed away. And so that experience of sort of losing this connection became sort of part of the art making practice that was happening at that time. So so the video is sort of a poetic um, kind of recounting of some of the issues that I was thinking about at the time. In particular, what does it mean that this, my family calls this place, this rice farm, home? But what does it mean that, like, I don't really have that? I have a relationship to it, but it's not the same. What does it mean that, we were really only there? My grandfather built the house. So, before that, it was indigenous, maybe not right before that, but originally this was indigenous land that, like, displaced people came in to occupy, and really the indigenous people were forced out. Um, and so kind of thinking about like what is our relationship to the land, what is our relationship to place, what is our relationship to these histories, and also kind of reflecting on a lot of the stuff that we just can't know. There's just like a lot of information that wasn't shared, a lot of trauma that I think was covered up and not articulated verbally, but we still have to process behaviorally and culturally. Um, and so that was all kind of tied into this project. And so along with this, so this is a video projection, and on the floor is a floor painting, and this references Rangoli, which is sort of like a folk practice in South Asia, in Hindu communities in particular, where women will create these floor paintings for festivals, and it's a way to make a space sacred. I also lined the edges of like the corner between the floor and the ceiling with earth. So when you went into the space, it felt like you were like down in the ground. And then these are a series of images that went along. This is one of a series of images that went along with the installation. And they're called mudras. And so mudras, I named them mudras, but a mudra is a hand symbol. It can be used in dance to tell stories. It's used in meditation to sort of channel energy. And so I was sort of finding these mudras in the photographs that I was taking. And so kind of thinking about this tenuous relationship that we have to our culture, the belief systems that were kind of left behind and fractured and erased. And so it's sort of this mudra, but it exists in this sort of white void where a lot of erasure has happened. Okay, so now we're gonna like take a really big jump in terms of content. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. I have so many slides. I don't think I'm gonna get through them all. Sorry, everybody. I sort of made this shift sort of after this project where I moved away from talking directly about the family histories. I got the sense from my extended family that they felt very exposed by the work, and I can understand, you know, like they kind of wanted to move on. They were not as invested in kind of digging up things that they kind of wanted to leave buried. And so I kind of shifted away from that a little bit and tried to think about how I could talk about these issues, but kind of in a larger sense, kind of zooming out, and then maybe in a way that was more about resistance and less about just kind of digging up the trauma, but also like how do we like move forward from there. So I created this series in 2015 called How to Be a Monster. There's sort of two things that it's reacting to. The first thing was Michael Brown being called a thug on television after he was murdered, and then also being called a demon by the man who murdered him. And so I don't know how, for those of you who might not remember, this was, I think it was late 2014 that a police officer shot Michael Brown outside of St. Louis. And this was really one of like the sort of major catalysts for the Black Lives Matter movement. So I was thinking about how a grown man who's trained would see a teenager as a demon. And it reminded me of this book that I had read where it's called Much Maligned Monsters. And it was about how when Europeans went to India, what they describe, like they would look at a sculpture and they would describe it in their travel journals. But since we still have the sculpture, we know that what they were describing wasn't actually what the sculpture was. So they might say like it had horns and hooved feet. And this is like how Europeans would have depicted a devil, but we have the sculpture still, and it doesn't have like horns and hooked feet. So, so really, we have like textual evidence that when Europeans encountered something so other, they actually just projected their own. I guess in Jungian terms, you might say their own shadow, like they projected the things that they repress onto the other. And so I was really thinking about that relationship in terms of how it functions in white supremacy, in a white supremacist society. And also thinking about the ways in which I'm projected on as a woman of color. So I decided to perform as goddesses, to create these tableaus that really strongly reference, religious iconography that is very sort of mass produced in India. So these are gestures, these are mudras and body positions that have been pretty stable for like thousands of years, but I'm incorporating them, but I'm letting them kind of happen in the present. So this is the goddess Durga as Pulan Devi. And just a really quick backstory about Pulan Devi. This is where a slight discussion about sexual violence is going to happen. I'll try to keep it kind of low key, but essentially Pulan Devi was kidnapped by thuggies, like the marauders. And basically she was basically her cousin had her kidnapped because she was causing trouble in the community, because she was like a low caste person, and sometimes people would have somebody of low caste do work for them and then refuse to pay them. And so she was actually organizing for labor rights in her community. And this was, and her more rich, higher caste cousin like didn't like this. And so he had her attacked and sexually assaulted as a young girl. And then he had her kidnapped by a group of bandits. And then basically one of the bandits falls in love with her, and she becomes a co-leader of the bandits. And then later on, her lover is murdered, and she is kidnapped by a rival group of bandits who are a higher caste, and she is gang raped and kept in this like shed in the middle of a village for a week. And then her thug group comes and rescues her, and then a little while later, she shows back up with a rebuilt gang of marauders, and they execute every man that was in the village. And there's sort of a question about whether or not she ordered this to happen, but it became this sort of like became this kind of like folk hero, and she evaded arrest for 10 years until she finally just kind of turned herself in. And then she was kept in actually, I don't know if it was 10. She evaded arrest. She was like very famously evaded arrest. And then she was put into prison without trial for 10 years. And while she was there, a hysterectomy was performed on her without her consent. So she was sterilized. And the doctor basically said before the procedure that they're doing it to prevent her from creating any other poulons. So, then she gets out eventually, and then basically is elected to what's it called, to parliament, and then assassinated. So she had this like life of like incredible resistance to a really violently patriarchal and caste based society, and caste is quite closely related to the system that we have in place in the United States. There's actually a book that was recently written about this, kind of comparing the two systems. So we can think of it as being discursively related to how white supremacy operates in the United States. So I'm performing as Pulan Devi, who is also performing as the goddess Durga, and so that's her positioning. And Durga sits on top of either a lion or a tiger, and so here she's sitting on top of a white man. And then I also want to mention another piece in this series, because this becomes a performance persona that comes up a couple of times. So this is the goddess Lakshmi. She's the goddess of wealth. But here she's, you know what, I might have to skip over some things. Anyways, so here she's kind of like a Kim Kardashian-esque woman in the present, making it rain. But so she's embodying some of the ideals of the culture, of the overculture, of the dominant culture, but she is also kind of subverting them, because she's got like her capitalist pig on a leash. White supremacy is in a submissive position to her. So in a lot of ways, these are kind of the futures that the dominant culture fears. It thinks that we'll just sort of, that oppressed people will just reenact the violence that was sort of perpetrated on them. And in a way, this is sort of poking fun at that fear. But also sort of thinking about presenting you with these sort of purposefully provocative images of power in the hands of non-white men, and what that can kind of like, what possibilities can that open up. So then I made a video piece that retold that story of Phulan Devi, but from 3 different perspectives. So the first one was the perspective of Aji, this sort of kind of fused imagination of my foremothers, and my foremothers sort of turned into this goddess figure. And so she has a she's silent in the video, but then there's a voiceover that's sort of maybe her interiority. And then the second part is the goddess Durga as Phulan Devi, direct addressing the camera, telling her story. And then the final portion of the video is a recording of a live performance I did as the goddess Lakshmi, where she goes to Hollywood Boulevard. Before COVID times, it was sort of this really interesting space where, you had like these out of town tourists and these like, shops, but then people would go there with their signs basically saying like, repent, the end is near, or like whatever it was that they were. So I kind of felt like the goddess would sort of go there to broadcast her message. And so her message was a poem kind of about sort of healing from these legacies of trauma and resisting the dominant culture. So this was called Knife Woman, which is a reference to a Louise Bourgeois sculpture, which is another sort of interest of mine. So in the goddess Lakshmi, she went to the Women's March in January 2017. She shows up in various performances, both in Chicago when I used to live in Chicago, and then in LA now. But one of the things I wanted to share with you about her is that she does this poetry and performance circle. So it's a way to invite other poets, artists, dancers who are dealing with some of these issues of sort of ritual, generational trauma, healing practices. And so she performs this opening ritual, which is called Ritual for Decolonization. And it's some actions and a poem that she reads through her megaphone, because she is always protesting. And then these are some stills from the first time I did this. And so this is really it's definitely a collaborative project. So Scarlett Kim, and so you can see her performing with the it's sort of like a white dress with looks like 7 faces. So she is a local director, artist, performance artist, and she collaborates with me in creating these events. And then we also perform together sometimes. And if I have time, I'll show you one more image of our work together. So this was just an opportunity to sort of create a supportive environment for this type of work, because I think at the time I really felt like I didn't have a lot of spaces where I felt that my work was given the correct context. And I knew that there must be other artists who also felt the same way. And so this was really an opportunity to create the ideal context for the work that I wanted to do, but then also a way for us to come together with our related practices and support one another. I think because I'm short on time, I'm not going to get too deep into these sculptures. Just like a lot of backstory on these. So I want to get a chance to talk about SEL work. But these are similar in that they are thinking about art history and whiteness, and how whiteness is constructed, especially through classical art. And then breaking this apart and reassembling it into, so it's about rethinking the past, like rethinking the ways in which classical art was whitewashed, but then also imagining this sort of future where things break apart. So I was creating this as a lot like the first round in 2017 of protests against Confederate statues were happening. And I was kind of thinking, we really, our critique need to go beyond these representations of like actual white supremacist figures to think about how aesthetically white supremacy is sort of fed back to us constantly by this culture. And one of those ways is through this mythology of classical sculptures being pure white when they weren't, they were actually painted. Um, so, um, so yeah, so I kind of broke apart the sculptures, reassembled them, creating these sort of fantastical bodies that, I called antibodies. So they are maybe the immune response to white supremacy, but they're also maybe also resisting ideas um, of whiteness and presenting a new type of body. I'm just going to check because I'm seeing that there are some. Okay, yeah, I just want to check and see if there were any questions specifically about this work, but we can talk about the other questions at the end. So yeah, so I don't want to talk too much about these because I want to talk about some other work really quickly, and then talk about SEL very, very quickly. Actually, I think I have to move on to SEL now. I think just to close with my work, this is Cyborg Divinations. This is another piece that I performed with Scarlett, who I mentioned earlier. But I wanted to close with just mentioning sort of post-COVID, I have transferred the goddess Lakshmi into a virtual space. She'd already had an Instagram feed and a Twitter account, but now she has a YouTube channel. And I'm performing sort of like healing rituals that are inspired by ASMR videos. I don't know if you're familiar with ASMR, but certain people experience a sort of tingling sensation with certain sounds. And so my the poems that used to kind of get read live are now integrated into these ASMR videos. So if you're interested, check it out. I think if you just search either Womb Chamber or New Global Matriarchy on YouTube, you'll be able to find it. Or I can always share a link with you all if you're interested. So very, very quickly before we move on to Q&A, I wanted to talk a little bit about SEL. So in this sort of journey I've been on creatively thinking about trauma and healing practices, as an educator, I've also been thinking a lot about trauma because really right now in this moment, we're going through a global trauma with a pandemic and with calls for racial justice. But in a lot of ways, like the roots of a lot of why we can't deal with what's happening run really deep. So several hundred years of capitalism and colonialism and the exploitation of people and people of color in particular. And then also, several thousand years of patriarchy and sort of this culture of domination. And so like the healing that will need to happen, after or during and in the future is going to sort of be deep and require kind of a lot of attention and work on our part. And so I really like SEL as a framework. And so I want to talk a little bit about it. There is a critique, and I just want to sort of mention so SEL is social and emotional learning. And so they have these competencies that educators and administrators should try to build in students. Part of the problem is that a lot of the reasons that students and communities might struggle with these things is because of generational trauma and then also ongoing systemic oppression. And so so you have to be really careful when you talk about this work that you are also acknowledging that aside from the work on the individual of healing, there's also the work of creating a more equitable society so that that individual is not continually being traumatized and hurt, because you can't heal your way out of like continual trauma. So those two things have to happen. Like, I don't think we can wait until racial justice is achieved to heal people, but also you can't fully heal people if racial justice is not achieved. So those two things have to happen in parallel, and you really have to keep that in mind, like when you're talking about these practices, that you're doing it in a way that is acknowledging, it's not victim blaming. It's not like blaming people, like if you have like if young people have trouble managing managing their stress, like that's not 100% on them, you know. um, so these are the core competencies. This is the Castle wheel. If you want to learn more, you can visit Castle's website. They have a really nice breakdown of this. I just want to maybe go a couple minutes over my talk time just to touch on a couple things with SEL. So one of the competencies is self-management, which is the ability to successfully regulate one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors in different situations. And so there are different ways that this can be developed by educators. And I think that art is an incredible opportunity to like almost like every single SEL competency is something that art engages with. So goal setting, like having to time out your projects so you get it done in time. Organizational skills, like you need that to be a successful artist. Self-motivation, that's, you know, they acknowledge that's something you can't teach, but many people are engaged by art. So one of the things that I want to talk about was stress management, because that's a big one that I've been working a lot I work in youth development with high school juniors and seniors. And this is something that I've really been focusing on because this is a really stressful time. And I think we're going to need a lot of practices around this now and moving forward. And so stress management is thinking about diet, exercise, rest, and sleep, healthy boundaries. I'm constantly talking to my students about getting enough sleep and having boundaries and not working at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is not healthy and not a good way to manage stress. And doing, you know, breathing exercises like the exercise we did at the start of this session, or other types of self-care. And so I find that it's best when engaging with SEL is to do your own research and follow your own interests and come up with your own practices that you can then incorporate into your work, because it's most effective when it's authentic. So if you're just like finding something and someone said that it was good and you're just doing it, that's not going to be a very effective way to deliver an SEL practice. But if, you know, you really enjoy talking about eating well, as long as it's, you know, research based, you could create art projects around, you know, what it means, you know, maybe like food justice and healthy eating. And you know, there's like a lot of ways that we can sort of bring this up in our practices as educators and people who work with youth. Okay, I do want to leave time for questions. So I just really briefly, another competency is social awareness. And I feel like in particular, this idea of perspective taking and empathy that's part of social awareness is a huge part of art. And appreciating diversity, respect for others, these are things that I think we've always engaged with as artists, but as educators, I think it's really important that we start to think about very intentionally, like how do we create relationships in our classrooms, relationships between students and administrators that that really build this, you know, and that you really can be like an agent for change in the world and in your school community by engaging with these ideas. So I encourage you to learn more and, you know, follow your interests in that regard. But I do feel like this is something that a lot of people countywide are talking about in education, in K-12 education in particular. There's a lot of training happening on the county level for teachers around this. So, so I encourage you to learn more. And I'm done.
Awesome. I'm just going to read some questions to you from the chat because they're really good. And I think you're, and I know that you want to spend some time, but thank you so much for talking in depth about your work. This one's from Jamie Siza. Inherited residual trauma is so integral to your identity and work. Do you have any recommendations for another multiracial female artist who doesn't have living family to confirm their history? I feel I carry ancestral trauma, but have no closure to know exactly what's happened.
Sorry, could you read that one more time?
I know it's
like a multi-part question. Yeah.
So do you have any recommendations for a multiracial female artist who doesn't have living family to confirm their history? So I guess what she's talking about is that she carries an ancestral trauma also, and she doesn't have any closure because she doesn't have anyone to talk to.
Yeah, and actually, you know, I really identify with that because I also don't have a lot of closure. I think that there's a lot of stuff that I can kind of guess, like when I hear the story that like my grandmother's grandmother was kidnapped by marauders. I don't think that she was just kidnapped, you know, by a bunch of men and nothing happened to her between then and the boat, you know, but like nobody would talk about that. And yeah, and I think a lot of my work sort of thinks about these gaps in information. And I think in terms of like a creative practice, I open up that space for research on first, you know, like I definitely did a lot of research about like history. But then also that's the place where creativity can happen, right? That's the place where fiction can happen. That's the place where, you know, you can sort of imagine, I don't want to say imagine closure, but like that through your creativity, often you're able to hold these multiple contradictory and unresolved realities together in a way that I feel like I think in a more sort of intellectual approach, like that would be too difficult, right? Like, you know, but I think that creative practices are actually really the place where you can start to engage with that uncertainty and create from that uncertainty. And then I think also just on like a personal level, you know, obviously I think huge advocate for therapy. Therapy was like very important to my personal journey. I do self-help stuff, but I also have a therapist to like, because you can't get stuck in your own head or your own perspective. But I think listening to your body, like there were so many things that I have been able to sort of just uncover from like what is causing me anxiety? Like, why am I afraid of this thing? And sort of unpacking that, like, this is something that I inherited and like, I don't have actual trauma over this thing. And being able to see that helps you. There's this amazing author, the book is called Women Who Run with Wolves, and I highly recommend that. Or she also has an audiobook called The Power of the Crone. But in Women Who Run with Wolves, she sort of talks about dismembering the dark man, who's like this sort of mythical figure that haunts your dreams. And so a lot of the times, like once you can see, like the idea is that you have to look at the thing that's triggering you, and by looking at it, acknowledging where it comes from, you can dismember it and put together into something more useful for you. So I know that's like super abstract, but there are lots of, I think, resources for women of color about like ancestral healing that I recommend. But Women Who Run with Wolves is definitely a good one.
Awesome. What are some good ways? This one's from Jocelyn Monge. What are some good ways to integrate SEL into our curriculum as art educators?
I think it's looking at what you're already interested in, right? So I'm trying to think of like a good, so for instance, yeah, I don't know, like I feel like it can be so specific. I'm trying to figure out like a way to talk about it generally, but I think it comes from, you know, what do you care about and how can you find the connections to the SEL competencies? So if you're really into like social justice, then like appreciating diversity and empathy are going to naturally align with that. And then you could look up, you know, there are all these websites with different ideas for lesson plans, and then you can kind of work with that to inspire your lesson plan. If you're interested in performance and the body, then maybe that's more about like, you know, self-care and stress management, because those are things that are built into like a performance practice. If it's if you're like somebody who's like a hardcore painter, like maybe it's like goal setting and like time management, you know, for your paintings. Like it could be so many different things, but I think start with what you are most interested in, and find the connections that are authentic to your interests and your practice as an educator.
Awesome. Let's see. Thank you. This is Edith Lagunas. Thank you for sharing today. My question is, when creating, what do you hope your viewer takes away from the experience?
Yeah, so I think that goes back to like my first slide about like the moment of seeing Anna Mendietto's work. And I want to create these moments that open something up for people, that present like new ways of thinking about themselves, about the world, about history, about community. So I think, you know, maybe I have like different goals with each art object, but I think ultimately it's about entering into like a new space of thinking about all of these things.
Awesome. Let's see. This is from Kelly Dow. What advice would you give for students to be self-motivated, as that clearly plays a big role in your artwork?
Be self-motivated. Wow. Well, you know, I think the only thing I can say is like authenticity, right? And actually, this is actually a really good question, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. You know, I showed that first work, and I've been thinking a lot about like where I was at when I started making work, and the ways in which certain types of power structures got into my head and made me question what I was doing. And I struggle the most when I'm not listening to myself. And I think that you can get, you know, critique is good and feedback is good, but you can get so wrapped up in what other people are going to be perceiving that you lose track of like why you're even doing this in the first place. And like that, like whenever I'm struggling, it's because it's like my body is literally telling me like, you're not listening. And so I'm going to make you tired, or I'm going to make you sick, or I'm going to make you distracted, and I'm going to make you, but like when I'm just like sitting and just listening to that sort of inner voice, and it's just like, you don't need motivation because it just flows. And then I think also, the second thing I will say, which is actually will sound like the exact opposite of what I just said, was being really intentional about making time for you to just be with your materials and to work. So it's like committing that like every Saturday from this time to this time, I'm not going to schedule anything else, and I'm just going to be with my materials, and I'm just going to play around with them. Because I think the easiest thing to do is to just be so distracted by all the different things that you have to do that you don't just make time. And so even though I'm talking about being free and listening to yourself, there's that structure, right? There's that self-management and goal setting and time management is giving yourself that space where you're just allowed to be free. And yeah, and I think also, so yeah, those are my two points about staying motivated.
That's such a beautiful concept to like sort of end on, is like giving yourself the space to be free. And it's such a simple thing, but I think that in terms of social emotional learning goals and even just life goals as an artist, that's what we're all trying to do, right? And acknowledging that, honoring that, and then honoring your experience is so important. I thank you so much. You're such an inspiring artist to me personally, I have to say. For all of the students, you have no idea how hard the Jacob Javits application is, and it's super impressive that you won that award. As somebody who tried and failed, I'm just in awe that you are such an accomplished writer, such an accomplished artist, and your images are so powerful and influential, I think. And I think you come from this rich cultural background, and there's so many artists that you're talked about even just today that are wonderful heroines to take into consideration when you're designing lessons for students to look at. And so I really appreciate how thoughtful your presentation was, and I know you could probably talk for another hour, but for the sake of time and because all of these students want to start their fall break, I know, but thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you also Maya for presenting. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.